Good afternoon. It's Sunday, the 20th of September. I'm Laura Cornfield, and this is IBA News broadcasting from Jerusalem. At the weekly cabinet meeting this morning, Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu told his ministers that Israel is not the ones changing the status quo on the Temple Mount in response to charges from the Palestinians and Arab states that Israel was escalating tensions at the holy site. Here with more is Eli Walgalanter.
Prime Minister Netanyahu addressed the tensions in Jerusalem in recent weeks, saying the ones behind the wild and baseless incitement, such as that Israel is trying to prevent Muslim prayer at the Temple Mount or other wild accusations, are the ones causing the incitement. This is coming from the Muslim Brotherhood, the Islamic movement in Israel, Hamas, and unfortunately also the active participation of the Palestinian Authority, the Prime Minister said. He also discussed the change in the rules of engagement toward those throwing rocks and Molotov cocktails in Jerusalem, saying they had already been instituted by police over the weekend. Netanyahu said that the cabinet was set to pass further measures to give security forces more tools to deal with rioters in the capital. In addition, the Prime Minister said the government was starting to promote legislation that would punish the parents of minors who throw stones and Molotov cocktails. We cannot accept the principle that people organize mass terror and start throwing bottles at passing cars or throwing rocks, killing people, said Netanyahu, referring to the death of Jerusalemite Alexander Levlevitz on Rosh Hashanah Eve. This norm will not continue here. It will be just the opposite, he told the cabinet. We will catch you in the act, and we will punish you to the full extent of the law. With all due respect to the court, we have the right and obligation to determine this norm, as we have done in relation to sexual offenses, and we will set a minimum sentence for rock throwers and for those throwing Molotov cocktails. U.S. Secretary of State John Kerry called for action to calm tensions on the Temple Mount, saying, quote, both sides need to avoid incitement and other actions that endanger relations between Israel and the PA. Meanwhile, Netanyahu will travel tomorrow morning to Moscow to meet with President Vladimir Putin to discuss both the deployment of Moscow's forces to Syria and the threats to Israel caused by weapon deliveries to Damascus, which could also be transferred to Hezbollah and other organizations. Netanyahu wants to hear from Putin what is the purpose, scope, and time frame for the Russian deployment. Israel is also concerned about confrontations that could possibly occur between Israeli troops and Russian forces who are active in Syria. Netanyahu will be accompanied on the trip by IDF Chief of Staff Gadi Eisenkot, as well as a number of key ministers. And finally, I would like to say goodbye to our loyal audience as I am leaving IBA. I just want to thank you all for watching and the warm support you've given me over the years. Laura?
Thank you. U.S. Secretary of State John Kerry said that Russia's movement of tactical aircraft and surface-to-air missiles to Syria could pose a threat to American and allied forces, but made clear that the U.S. could accept a resolution to the civil war that allows President Bashar Assad to remain in power for an unspecified time. Speaking after talks with British Foreign Secretary Philip Hammond in London, Kerry welcomed Moscow's involvement in battling Islamic State in Syria, but a worsening refugee crisis underscored the need to find a compromise that could also lead to political change in the country.
We need to get to the negotiation. That's what we're looking for. And we hope Russia and any Iran, other countries with influence will help to bring about that, because that's what's preventing this crisis from ending. We're prepared to negotiate. Is Assad prepared to negotiate, really negotiate? Is Russia prepared to bring him to the table and actually find the solution to this violence? Those are the pregnant questions. And we've made it very clear, we've been open, we've made it very clear that we're not being doctrinaire about the specific date or time. We're open. But right now, Assad has refused to have a serious discussion, and Russia has refused to help bring him to the table in order to do that. So that's why we're where we are. It is clear that the challenge to continental Europe, but to everybody, of the migrant population of refugees seeking a better life cannot be properly addressed just by addressing the numbers of refugees coming into a country or providing more support to them. It has to be addressed by dealing with the root cause, which is the violence in Syria and the lack of hope and possibility of a future that so many people in that region feel as a consequence of the violence that's taking place.
Joining me now in the studio is Russian affairs expert Dr. Stephanie Hoffman of the Hebrew University. Dr. Hoffman, thanks so much for coming in. What is Netanyahu hoping to achieve by his meeting with Putin in Moscow?
Well, like many Israeli prime ministers before him, he's making the trip, hoping to achieve at least certain minimum requirements. And obviously the most thing of greatest concern to Israel is that any arms deliveries to Syria will make their way to Hezbollah, and also to avoid any direct confrontation between Israeli forces which may be attempting to stop any deliveries of arms to Hezbollah, and that might involve a clash with Russian troops.
So there is strategic timing to this visit.
Yes, he has to present Israelis' point of view, although I'm sure he's aware that Israel is not exactly a superpower, and Putin is somebody who generally, when he has his mind made up, follows through. However, it should be noted that both Israeli and Russian officials have stated that neither country is an enemy of the other, and there are certain interests that Putin has in Israel. He often speaks favorably of the Russian compatriots here. I wouldn't treat that as so seriously, but there are common interests. Israeli gas development in the Mediterranean, which Russia has expressed an interest in its development. There are also an interest in Israeli technology. They recently supposedly bought Israeli drones, and also an interest in Israeli intelligence concerning jihadi forces that are anti-Russian, Chechens, and so forth.
Dr. Hoffman, what are Russia's long-term intentions in its arms buildup in Syria?
Everybody has their own speculation, but certain things do seem clear. And one, it's trying to shore up Assad's regime, which lately has been in rather deep trouble. And Russia traditionally, over 40 years, has been an ally of Syria in this region. And in shoring up Syria, it keeps a foothold in the Middle East and also tells the West, look, Russia is a power that has to be contended with, and that by extension take Russia into consideration in other world issues, as well as if you want to help settle this issue, which is of course important to the West, not only in Syria, but now all the refugees that are flowing into the West. Maybe you'll have a second idea about what's going on with Russia in Ukraine and Crimea, perhaps a reduction there in sanctions and so forth.
By Kerry's comments that we just heard, the United States appears to be trying to accommodate the Russians rather than confronting them. Is this the correct policy in your opinion?
I don't think the U.S. has, given what it has done lately in the Middle East, I don't think it has much choice in another direction. The U.S. has made it very clear over the years that it doesn't want to have any boots on the ground, and it has generally backed away from leading the way in the Middle East. Therefore, I think Kerry's statement is an acknowledgement that even for some relief, U.S. will have to deal with Russia, although ultimately I don't think this is going to lead to a resolution.
Dr. Stephanie Hoffman of the Hebrew University, always great to have you here. Thanks so much.
Thank you.
Scores of Sderot residents demonstrated at the Yad Mordechai Junction outside their town last night, protesting the government's failure to stop the sporadic rocket and gunfire from the Gaza Strip. The protest came just 24 hours after a missile exploded in the yard of a family that was gathered for a Sabbath meal, causing damage and panic, but no injuries. The protesters accused the government of impotence and demanded action to put a stop to the cross-border aggression. Meanwhile, Hamas has announced it has captured an Israeli Air Force reconnaissance drone, which fell in a field in the northern Gaza Strip. The IDF spokesman's office did not confirm or deny that claim, saying only that they did not comment on such issues. The funeral of former Supreme Court Vice President Mishael Cheshen, who passed away yesterday, will be held at Kibbutz Givat HaShlosha in about an hour from now. Following news of his death, Cheshin was eulogized by a wide range of leading figures, including Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, who said Cheshin had a sharp, original, and compassionate mind. Opposition leader Isaac Herzog called Cheshin a giant of the Israeli legal system. Cheshin died at his home in Herzliya at the age of 79 after a long struggle with cancer. Turkish police arrested an Israeli Arab mother of 5 last month as she attempted to travel to Syria to join Islamic State. This was revealed today by the Shin Bet security forces. 44-year-old Ayman Kanju from Shfaram was indicted today in the Haifa District Court for attempting to join the terrorist organization, trying to travel to an enemy country, and contacting a foreign agent. She arrived in Turkey last month with $11,000 in order to make the trip. Kanju made contact with a member of Islamic State who promised to assist her in reaching Syria by way of Turkey. 2 days later, Turkish police captured her as she attempted to cross the border into Syria. Turkish authorities sent her back to Israel, where she was promptly arrested by security forces upon arrival at Ben Gurion Airport. She admitted to Shin Bet interrogators that she had been planning for months to join Islamic State. Eran Malka, a police investigator who accepted bribes from prominent Israeli lawyer Ronel Fisher, was sentenced to 8 years in prison today after pleading guilty to money laundering, fraud, breach of trust, and obstruction of justice, in addition to the charges of graft. Malka was accused of passing sensitive details of ongoing investigations to Fisher, who then used the information to the benefit of his clients. The presiding judge said that the defendant was not only a guardian of the law, but was also supposed to uphold and strengthen the foundations of the rule of law. Malka will be granted 2 weeks under house arrest to prepare for his jail time and say goodbye to his family. Yesh Atid chairman Yair Lapid slammed Netanyahu's management of the Iran deal this morning, saying Netanyahu's arrogance and bluntness in speaking before Congress without a direct invitation by President Barack Obama is to blame for the tense relationship between Israel and the United States. Speaking at Bar-Ilan University, where he presented his political plan and vision for the future of the state of Israel, Lapid said there should never have been a need for a congressional vote on the Iran deal. And he suggested that if Netanyahu had handled the deal differently, Israel could have been the 7th country sitting at the table during the nuclear deal negotiations to protect Israel's national interests. According to Lapid, Netanyahu should have picked up the phone to the King of Saudi Arabia, King Salman, immediately after the interim deal in Lausanne to coordinate our position with him and the Gulf states, and then gone to speak to Obama. Iranian President Hassan Rouhani told the United Nations nuclear chief Yukiya Amano today that his agency should be fair in its implementation of the nuclear deal reached between Iran and the world powers. Amano arrived in Tehran earlier in the day to discuss outstanding issues. It was Amano's second visit to Iran in the past 3 months. Rouhani also reiterated that Iran has no intention of developing a nuclear weapon. Amano's visit comes less than a month before an October 15th deadline to gather information on allegations that Iran had in the past tried to build atomic weapons. A final UN assessment is due in December. In more local news, the man who was critically injured 3 days ago in Gan Yavne in a gas explosion died of his wounds and was buried a short time ago. Police are continuing to investigate the cause of the canister explosion. The wife of the victim remains hospitalized in critical condition. The couple's son, who lived with his parents, told investigators that the apartment was rented as is and they did not make any changes to the gas installation. The body of Amir Ohana, the Israeli who has been missing in Oman, Ukraine since Rosh Hashanah, has been found. The Foreign Ministry and Israel's embassy in Ukraine said they are taking steps to bring his body to Israel for burial. The 28-year-old Ohana went missing when he found a spot in the woods near a lake for seclusion, which is part of the tradition for Rosh Hashanah prayers there. The disaster victim identification organization Zaka said that Ohana, who had epilepsy, apparently had a seizure while alone and fell into the lake. In these days of repentance, atonement comes early if you're a chicken. Our own Ari O'Sullivan set out to examine the traditional practice of kaparot and brings us this report.
Should it be made illegal to prevent what has traditionally taken place for hundreds of years, the atonement of sins by relaying them to a live chicken? The city of Tel Aviv has forbidden the tradition from taking place in public. The debate over the custom has been gaining ground recently, particularly by the zealous animal rights groups.
These chickens, about 40 days old, are brought from the meat industry to be slaughtered in public in crowded conditions. They grab them by the wings and shake them all over people's heads. It's brutal and unnecessary and shocking, particularly in days when we are trying to carry out good deeds before this day of self-examination.
The 10 days of repentance are aimed at atoning for our sins before the Lord. And an alternative to the public slaughter of chickens is by offering a donation to the needy. Asa Kesar is a Haredi man and says even the sages say that giving to the poor should prevail over butchering a chicken. This year, the Agriculture Ministry has put out a cartoon that urges the public to refrain from carrying out the tradition and making a donation instead. It doesn't matter what you do, but it's preferable to butcher a chicken of atonement. Those who carry out the ceremony say the chickens are not slaughtered on site, but are brought to a butcher in an organized manner. But still, the sight of waving a chicken over people can be shocking.
The media are making a big deal about this and making people feel like the poor chicken is suffering. But the rabbis have issued rulings to all those who partake in the tradition to make sure the birds don't suffer.
In these days of forgiveness, the question is being raised that perhaps this isn't suitable anymore for these modern times. Ari O'Sullivan for IBA News.
Turning abroad, Greeks are voting today in their third national polls this year, calling on to choose on who they trust to steer the country in its new international bailout. Former Prime Minister Alexis Tsipras' left-wing Syriza party, which made pledges to implement austerity measures in return for billions of euros in rescue loans, was marginally ahead of the rival center-right New Democracy in opinion polls leading up to the vote. But the polls, which showed many of the 9.9 million voters were undecided until 2 days before the vote, or might abstain altogether, indicated the winner would not have enough votes to form a government alone. The 41-year-old Tsipras triggered the election by resigning barely 7 months into his 4-year term after facing a rebellion within Syriza over his policy U-turn in accepting the spending cuts and tax hikes stipulated by the bailout. Tsipras had won January elections on pledges of abolishing such measures tied to Greece's first 2 bailouts. He has argued he had no choice but to accept the demands of European creditors for more tax hikes and spending cuts in return for Greece's third rescue, a 3-year package worth 86 billion euros. He had vowed to repeal the measures imposed in return for the country's first 2 bailouts, and despite winning a referendum, he hastily called July 5th, urging Greeks to reject creditor reform proposals. Pope Francis opened his first full day in Cuba today with a mass before hundreds of thousands of people in Havana's Revolution Plaza after ordinary citizens turned out in droves yesterday to line Francis's motorcade route and welcome a man that many credit with helping bring about the thaw in relations between Cuba and the United States. Pope Francis wrote a personal appeal to Presidents Barack Obama and Raul Castro and hosted their delegations at a secret meeting at the Vatican last year to seal a deal after 18 months of closed-door negotiations. Since then, the 2 leaders have reopened embassies in each other's countries, held a personal meeting and at least 2 phone calls, and launched a process aimed at normalizing ties in fields ranging from trade to tourism to telecommunications. Upon his arrival, Pope Francis plunged headfirst into the rapprochement, urging the Cuban and U.S. governments to push forward on their newly forged path and develop all its possibilities. The skies will remain open during the wedding of supermodel Bar Raffaele. That was the decision today directly from Transportation Minister Israel Katz, canceling a previous announcement from the Civil Aviation Authority declaring airspace above the Carmel Forest Spa Resort a no-fly zone. The skies belong to all the citizens of the country, and one event should not be given priority over other events. Originally, the 30-year-old bride from Hod HaSharon hired 5 drones on her own to photograph her nuptials to businessman Adi Ezra, as well as 2 helicopters for her and the groom's transportation, and even a hot air balloon to secure the event and possibly provide additional photographs. No unauthorized aircraft would have been permitted to fly within 4 kilometers or below 3,000 feet of the venue starting at 5 p.m. on Thursday until 2 a.m. Friday morning, and any pilots caught doing so risk losing their licenses. According to senior aviation officials speaking to The Marker, civilian pilots were incensed by the closure, which they denounced as contempt toward Israel's airspace and its abuse for a celebrity's private event by turning the skies into a no-man's land. And now for a look at something a bit further out in space. NASA has released a new animation of a flyover of Pluto that was created from a mosaic of hundreds of pictures taken when the New Horizons spacecraft observed the planet during its mid-July flyby. The animation shows the surface from a height of about 200 kilometers and demonstrates the contrast in brightness between two different regions, said to be one of the largest natural brightness variations of any object in the solar system. Taking a look at local finance, with no currency trading on Sundays, the shekel remains the same, while share prices on the Tel Aviv Stock Exchange started off the trading week in the mixed column. Here's a look at the mid-afternoon numbers. And turning to the forecast, and a significant drop in temperatures is predicted tomorrow, with local rain expected in the north and center of the country. Here are the highs and lows for the next 24 hours at home and abroad. And that's all for this newscast. This programming note, there will be no IBA news this Tuesday and Wednesday due to the Yom Kippur fast day. Aaron Viner will be here tomorrow with more news from Israel and abroad. Until then, I'm Laura Cornfield wishing you a great evening and shalom from Jerusalem.